Hey friends, I just want to say thank you for watching this video. What I want to do is share a little bit of the story of my family's life as a parable, almost as a metaphor for the Hmong-American church. And so you're going to watch this video till the very end to see where I'm going with it, but I think it's going to be helpful to you. And with metaphors and with parables, there's not a direct correlation between details of a story and the reality. But the reality of our life and the details of our life story, I think, helps to, kind of flesh out what I think are some of the basic storylines and the plots that we're experiencing as a Hmong-American church. And so I want to talk about the parable of the Hmong-American family, specifically how that pertains to the development of the church here in America over the last 40 years. And you can kind of guess that the people behind this title screen is my family. This is my wife Linda and our 4 boys and our little girl Sarah. And we were from Detroit. All of my kids were born in Detroit. I should say my oldest kids were born in Detroit, where I grew up and where we spent the first 10 years of our marriage. We belonged to an immigrant Hmong church there in Detroit, served there. And just loved that we're going to live the rest of our life there. That really was how we were planning our life. And through a series of events, when I was 24, I went through a deconstruction of my own faith. Came out of that 2 years later, and just decided that, if I'm going to be a Christian, I need to know the Bible. So I did what I don't recommend people doing, is I paid my way through seminary to learn the Bible, not to become a pastor, not to become a church planter or a missionary, but to learn the Bible. But in the midst of that, I was asking a lot of questions about who I am as a Hmong, as an American, and what did Jesus intend for that to mean, and the intersection of that and the church. And so from that, I deduced from my own story that God must have called people like us to be here as missionaries, to be part of his global church here in America. So I began thinking about how this was not just developing my personal life, but also my vocational life, and that led us to at the time, I was an engineer. At the time, my wife, Linda, was a buyer for Ford, and we left our careers to become church planters, to become missionaries here in North America, sent by God as Hmong-Americans to reach all kinds of people. That was an interesting transition for us because Detroit was home. I grew up in a predominantly African-American city. And so going to the next place that we were going to was a huge jump for us. So when at the age of 29, through a series of events that God had kind of orchestrated, we left our home in Detroit, where I grew up in the inner city, to a white, affluent suburban community outside of Fort Worth called Keller. We lived in a city called South Lake. And it was probably the most cultural transition that we had ever made, growing up in an immigrant church, growing up in inner city Detroit, and then now affluent white suburban community on staff at a predominantly white mega church. I was invited to be the young adults pastor, associate worship pastor, and being trained to plant churches by my spiritual mentor, Bob Roberts Jr. And it was a big transition for us, huge transition. We left, 20 plus years of Detroit, our first 10 years of marriage and ministry together in the immigrant Hmong church, and now dropped into this place that was completely different. I joke around with people, like, growing up in inner city, navigating the alleys and the streets of Detroit were not as scary to me as was the affluent white suburban Republican communities of Dallas, Fort Worth. And then God just did a work in our hearts. And he said, it didn't matter, how smart you are. It doesn't matter how much you work on cultural contextualization. If you don't love people, especially those who are different from you, you can't make a difference. And that was a big challenge in our heart. But also during that time, my spiritual mentor, Bob, he also challenged me and really said, I remember we were sitting down for lunch, and I was sharing with him the intersection of my national and ethnic identity and, what I was supposed to be doing. And I was just kind of frustrated. I don't know who I am really in the larger context of the church, but I knew who I am as an immigrant or a child of immigrants, second gen. And he said to me, and it may sound condescending at first, but he wasn't being condescending. He said, Daniel, you have to stop thinking like a minority. And you have to start thinking like the global citizen that you are. And that was a huge shift for me, because it went from me thinking that as a minority I have a disadvantage to now, what was a disadvantage is now actually an advantage, because it is true. We are global people as second-gen immigrants, specifically as Hmong people. And we straddle this worldview between East and West. And that was really helpful to me. And that really gave me courage. And in the discernment process, we decided that we were going to plant a church in one of the cities, one of the world's most diverse cities in the world, and that was Toronto. So at the age of 32, so we went to Texas when we were 28, 29, stayed for 3 years, transitioned to Toronto. We were sent up to plant a multi-ethnic church in downtown Toronto, where there are like 0 Hmong people. Thank God we had some really dear friends that we met up with there eventually, Bruce and Dorch Yang, who came up to do a church planting residency with us to learn from all of our mistakes. Eventually they went out and planted in Sacramento, Gospel City Church. But we, along with our newly found friends, Mike and Mrs. Seaman, we planted this church in downtown Toronto that was multi-ethnic, it was urban, it was missional, it was embedded in the community, it was reaching hard to reach people. And it was a beautiful church. We miss it like crazy. Spent 5 years in Toronto. And as beautiful as it was, let me tell you, like I would stand up and preach on Sunday mornings, and I would look into this beautiful congregation that God allowed us to be a part of putting together. And as much as I felt loved by the people that we were leading, I never really felt completely known. Because I know that although they knew about like a little bit of our story as Hmong Americans and as refugee immigrants, I know that we didn't share that story with people. And so even though we felt loved, we didn't feel fully known. So that wasn't the reason why we left. It was through an orchestrated series of events. Was going to start a PhD, God opened up a door. It was very crazy, charismatic, like prophetic type stuff. We ended up 5 years later here in Chicago, where I am now working for the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, directing Church Multiplication Institute. Lynn and my wife is working for World Relief, helping to resettle refugee immigrants. And then, now we're helping to plant another multi-ethnic church here, the Prodigal Network, that's at the inception is led predominantly by a team of Hmong leaders, but here as missionaries to reach all kinds of people. A little bit different than Toronto, a little bit different from our immigrant church that we grew up in, but a predominantly core Hmong team, Pan-Asia team that's trying to be a multi-ethnic church in Chicagoland. And that's where we're at in 2022. And we're 5 years into our journey here in Chicagoland, 2 years into planting that church, mostly in the pandemic. But again, I use this as a metaphor, as a parable of what I think the church, the Hmong-American church, is experiencing right now. And I pose this question. So are we the church in Jerusalem, or are we the church in Antioch? The church in Jerusalem was primarily Jewish, composed of Jewish leaders, and it was ethnically and culturally located in Jerusalem. And then you have the church in Antioch, which is, in our modern terms, multi-ethnic. It was global. It was for the world. And so is it Jerusalem or is it Antioch? And I think that's a genuine tension that many of you feel. Am I called to be in the Jerusalem church? Am I called to be in the Antioch church? And I think that tension, that we're trying to force a dichotomy when we shouldn't force a dichotomy, because I think it's both. I think many of us are from the church of Jerusalem and we stay connected, and then we're the church of Antioch and we're meaningfully there, and we're part of both. And that's really what I want to talk about. And that's these are various mottos of thinking about how we're trying to straddle the fence of Jerusalem and Antioch. There are children who stay in their parents' house. Think about the Hmong house. Think about the immigrant house, and how mom and dad want you to stay and take over the house and pay the bills and really build on top of their shoulders, and maybe even stay in the home that they that they have created physically. And that for us was Detroit in some ways. It was staying in the parents' house, staying with my parents. We lived with my parents after I got married for about 6 to 8 months, trying to build up, a nice down payment on a home. So we're two houses or two households under one house. And there are those of us who are called to do that. Now, admittedly, that's hard to do, especially when you have different ways of running the household. But there are those of us who are called to be children that stay in your parents' house. And then there's others of us who are children with their parents' heart, but they're building a new house for their family. The neat thing about this is a picture of City on the Hill Church in Detroit. I always tell people that this is the church that I always wanted to plant and never got to plant because it was a second-gen church that was planted out of our home church with some of the people that we love, and God called Pastor Tula to come and lead a group of people that we had did life with so much and even envisioned second-gen ministry with, and he planted City on the Hill, a beautiful church that's there now. This is children with a parent's heart building a new house for their family. And some of us are called to do that. We've got churches all over the United States that are beginning to identify as second-gen churches, or however way they want to use that language, but it's people who still have the heart and the culture of their parents, and they want to bring that into a new house for their family to build on top of. And then there are those who are fostered by another family. And this is kind of a weird way to talk about it, but there are those of us who did end up leaving. And not being kicked out, not being angry, but we entered into spaces that we had to learn an identity outside of our immediate ethnic community as Hmong people. And in some ways, they're like children fostered by another family. This is my mentor, Bob Roberts Jr., who invited me on staff at his church in Dallas, Fort Worth. And we were fostered into, I would say, in for all intents and purposes, like, white evangelical church. And it was a steep learning curve, and we are better for it. There were so many challenges. There still are challenges in this. But again, this represents for many of you a season of life, a stage of life, maybe even a long-term call. You're called into spaces that are different from the ones that you grew up in, even with a different mentality and a different heart. And the leaders and the people that you're learning from are not those who you grew up with. In a sense, you're being fostered by another family, but with intents and the purpose of being kingdom-minded and living out the kingdom outside of the immigrant church. And then there are those who are then children going out with a foster identity. Again, very similar to our experience. We were brought up, through Pastor Bob's leadership and his mentorship, and we went out with almost like a foster identity, not a false identity, but an intersection of both the immigrant Hmong and then like this evangelical, understanding of the church. And that was our time in Toronto, and trying to navigate, what does multi-ethnicity really mean? How do we meaningfully belong, and how do we meaningfully create multi-ethnic churches? So your children going out with a foster identity. And then there is a season, there's a time, some of us feel like we're children with our parents' heart. We love our culture, we love who we are, we're rediscovering that, and we're building a house for others. And I would say in some ways, here in Chicago, that's some of what we're experiencing, is we understand now more than ever than in our 20s, and probably even in our late 20s and early 30s, but now more than ever, that our cultural heritage, our missional narrative, our historical narrative means something, that shouldn't be hidden. It should be leveraged for the purpose of not just ourselves, but for others. How do we use our story to build a house for others? And I'd say that's kind of the season that we're here in Chicago. These are stories, or these are like frameworks. These are pictures of what, I'm saying are metaphors for maybe the different transitional phases that the church here in America specifically the Hmong church here in America, is experiencing. And the question you might ask is, which one of these models, these childs, which one is the best child of the house? Which one do we do more of? And for the most part, I think the practical, like the favorite child, the favorite child is the one who stays in the home, or the one who ends up building a house that's nearby mom and dad. And I think that's right. And I think that's so important. And I think that's what we need to do. But I think we need more of all of these models. I think it's a part of all of us. Yes, we need to have more second-gen churches. I really pray and hope, and that's what I want to give my life to. It's helping my peers and my friends who we've grown up together to try to figure out how do we be a more fresher expression of the church here in North America that's beneficial to all. But I also think we need more models, more versions of everything. I want you to feel released to do the thing that God has called you to do, because I think only you can do it. And you can't do what somebody else is doing because they've got their calling. Sometimes you find people with a very similar calling and you learn from each other. And I think we need to create more spaces like that. Again, let me say that again. Sometimes you find people that are doing similar or the same things that you're called to do, and we need to find more spaces for that. But we also need to find more spaces and create more spaces where all these different versions of these calls or these houses or ways to be, a children or a child or a son or daughter of the home, where we can come together and we can collaborate and learn from each other and be one house. And so I think that's so important for the season that we're entering into. But what is the best possible scenario for the majority of LAO-HMONG churches in America? And I say LAO-HMONG churches in America because specifically the kind of church that we have today in the majority of Hmong churches are LAO-HMONG Christians that came here as refugee immigrants, and they started churches here. So it was a church over here, and it was not uprooted, but obviously God's sovereignty through war and through immigration ended up here planting the vast majority of churches. But what is the best possible scenario for these churches? And the answer is, I don't really know. Yeah, not a prophet. I work for a nonprofit. I don't make a lot of profit. So I don't really know. But my last thing that I like to do is propose something to at least give us a framework to think about how the vast majority of Hmong churches that were planted 20, 30, 40, 42, 43 years ago, 1976, we believe is the first Hmong church that was established here in America, here in Wheaton, where I currently am making this video from. What's the possible way through for the majority of those churches? And what I want to present to you is an idea of the responsible child. And you can see I'm totally trying to appropriate some of the cultural values from being Hmong into this idea. But it's to say in our language, tu minyo wapota, the responsible child. And it kind of starts like this. You have the Hmong speaking church with the youth ministry. Minyo da nitzinyo. You have generational in the same house, Hmong speaking. And so there is ministry to the youth and to English speaking people. But by and large, it's, us living with mom and dad. And that's the vast majority of churches. And so you grow up in that. You're now 20, 30, some of us 40, pushing 50s even. And you're coming in and you're taking over and you're leading. Albeit some of y'all were really patient because that passing the baton took a very long time. But this is kind of where the majority of Hmong churches are in North America. There's a transition. There is a move towards English speaking services or even church planting, which is Minyo Muntia Jechia. And that's where, some of us have left the home and we bought our own house. We planted our own churches. We started our own English-speaking services. We have created spaces for, the hybrid Hmong-American person. Where your parents might be Hmong-American, you're probably a little bit more American Hmong in some ways. And those are the places that many of us have tried to pioneer. I would say I was part of that, over 10, 15 years ago, trying to be the one pushing the envelope to be Untitled. But I think where the vast majority of Hmong churches may be headed, if it's not one of these particular two models, is English-speaking churches with a Hmong ministry. Nietzi, Munda, Mignonyo. And this really does fit the model of the Hmong family. It may be this transition of planting churches so that one day those churches can receive, kind of the elderly into it. It may be that. Does it have to be that? Or maybe, in the current church that there is a changing of relational leadership. And so the second gen or third gen become primary leaders. But it's this idea that most of the churches, and I don't want to just make it about language and about English versus Hmong, but there is a mindset that comes with English-speaking people, which I hope that the vast majority of us still maintain our Hmong speaking ability, which I've worked hard to do. But it's the idea that we have a predominantly English-speaking congregation that's open to all kinds of people, still probably going to be majority Hmong. But then, parents are moved in. And I think this is kind of the mindset that most people want. But it's the models of how do we get there, and it could happen through church planting. So mother church sends out the daughter church becomes mature, mom moves in, potentially. Or it becomes, you're kind of in the same household, but you begin to realize that I got to change the lien over to, my son, my daughter, and they're going to lead. And I think a lot of people want that as well. But I think this whole idea of being the responsible child, not forsaking your home, not forsaking your parents, but at the same time realizing that I need to understand the greater context that I'm a part of, move forward in that. That could be a multi-ethnic model. It doesn't have to be, but it could be a multi-ethnic model. But how do I do that responsibly by not neglecting our first gen? And I think that is probably gets at the heart of the transition that is needing to happen. And I hope and pray that many of you will be courageous enough as someone who is staying in the home, as somebody who is planting or buying a house near mom and dad's home, or some of us who have left altogether and been fostered, or some of us who are keeping our identity and trying to create a space for others, that regardless of your model, your framework, regardless of which metaphor from our life it's the most for you, that you would create, the different opportunities, the different possibilities out there. Because I don't think it's so much about what's happening now, but I think what is happening now will actually give imagination in the next 10, 20 years for my children to have a better understanding of who they are and what God's called them to do. Your children, what has God called them to do? Who are they called to be? And I think if we do it with a sense of calling and conviction and purpose, that's going to give them the confidence to be even more innovative, and then also to remind themselves of their missional narrative as Hmong-Americans called to be missionaries, the hands and feet of Jesus here in North America.